We have an absolutely amazing panel lined up this morning to talk about the key question of our conference, Leadership in Transitioning Times. Let me just introduce to you in one-word sentences, going from this direction to the other side, our amazing panel. We have Libby Davies, former MP Vancouver East. We have Josha Macnab, the director of Pembina BC. We have Craig Suave, a councillor from Montreal. And we have Stephanie Smith, who's the head of the BCGEU. Welcome to you all. And with that said, we're going to ask Libby to take us away, Leadership in Transitioning Times.
Okay, is this good? You can hear me? All right. Well, first off, good morning. I'm very aware that it's Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and I hear that you had a very fulsome night, so I hope everybody had a good sleep. I'm very delighted to be here, and I was having breakfast earlier, and I sat with Vicky, who's a councillor from Saanich, and she told me that what she likes to do, because she's been a member of Toastmasters for how many years, Vicky? Long time. Long time. And she likes to critique the speakers on how they did in their performance. I thought, oh, that's really, really nice. Just no pressure, just raise the bar. She says, yes, I like to count how many ums and ahs people do. So I think she's got her notepad out, and she's going to do just that. There you go, my first Charlie, when she invited us to do this panel, she told me that she wanted me to speak about, quote, global electoral shifts in the Canadian context and the social upheaval that's underpinning this string of disruptive electoral results. I was like, oh, really? Well, that's great. I mean, I'll give it my best shot in a few minutes. So thanks, Charlie. But you've all been so great that I've heard that you're going to get the afternoon off, and she's bringing in spa qualities, and you're going to get a great afternoon. Oh, actually, what's the date? Oh, it's April the 1st. Yeah, sorry, you guys are going to be working hard. Forget that. She's not doing that. Anyway, down to my comments. You know, when I first ran for City Council in 1976 in Vancouver, I was 23 years old, and in those glorious days, municipal politics was mostly about potholes and dog shit. You know, there was development issues too, you know, zoning issues. Development was very big in the city and who controlled the city. But the scene and the situation with municipal politics was really narrow, and I was very fortunate to be part of a city council that really broadened the scope of what a city council should be about and what municipal leadership is about. And so I got my earliest experiences from running and then finally getting elected and being part of a council in the 1980s that did sort of broaden the horizon. So I feel very fortunate. Of course, today, 30 plus years later, the world is a very different place. And I think we all know we live in very uncertain times, and certainly on the municipal front, I'm sure you feel every day like you're on the front line of what's going on. And although there are huge global shifts in terms of the political environment and what's going on, we feel it at the municipal level. It's a very complex global arena. And in fact, if I could characterize it in a few words, I would say nothing is what it seems to be. You know, whatever it is we expect, it's different, right, in terms of the response and what's out there in the elections. And in thinking about this topic today and helping guide us through the discussion and the panel that we have today, I tried to think of some of the major factors that are involved in the shifts and the uncertainty and the complexities that are taking place both globally and locally. And so I identified three things. I know there are many others, but time does not permit a huge canvas. But I identified three things. One is the shift in media. Two is increased inequality. And three, simply put, people who are fed up with the status quo. I'm sure there's a fancier way to say that, but I kind of boiled it down to people get fed up. So on the first one, the media, you know, it used to be that the narrative of the media, there was kind of a common narrative, even though there might be different perspectives. People would watch the national news at night, and what they heard they could expect to see the next morning in the papers, or vice versa. And there was sort of a narrative out there. But what we've seen over the last few years is really the destruction of big media and the power that it has over the influences of what we think and what we see. It's completely fragmented, both on the left and the right. I think it's become more visible on the right in terms of how the media plays out and what the reaction is. But nevertheless, it's a fragmentation and a destruction of that narrative that we used to see in sort of a common way, even if we didn't agree with it. We see now things like fake news. We see people believing what they want, no matter what the truth is. We see social media that's an explosion, but also full of hatred and personal attacks. I mean, this is an absolutely new phenomenon of the last few years that we're all dealing with as elected representatives, as public figures. And the reality is that we've all now gotten used to developing and relying on our own individual sources of media and truth, even though it may defy credibility. And that's even true of the left. We're not, you know, progressive people, and I count us in this room as progressive people, we're not immune from that either. So what's the outcome of that complexity, the fragmentation, the destruction of big media? Well, certainly for elected representatives, it makes it a lot harder to engage. It's harder to know who you're engaging with. It's harder to get your message out because it is so scattered, it is so fragmented, and there's this sense that there's no common ground, there's no reference that you can hold on to, that you can even necessarily differentiate yourself from, because it's not about one truth, but there was this sort of sense of there was a narrative that took us forward. And the media has now become something that you can't rely on necessarily to use as a tool that I think many of us have been used to doing, to reach out to people and to share a common narrative. So that's a very difficult situation to deal with. Number two, inequality, the income gap. When I was a city councillor at City Hall, I used to love, about once a month or so, every 2 months, they would have these ceremonies in the break at the city council meeting, and they would call up the 25 years, the 30 years, the 35 years, the folks who had worked at City Hall for that time. And I used to love it. You know, you'd see the folks who had worked in garbage disposal, on the engineering, on streets, on water, and they would have these little ceremonies and a certificate, and it was really nice to see this kind of family, right, of people who had felt like they were part of the city of Vancouver. Now, I'm sure possibly they still have those ceremonies, but in today's work world, I mean, it's very rare to find anyone who has started work in the last few years that will be in the same place 20, 25, 30 years hence. And so the very nature of our work and employment and as a parallel track, the growing inequality in this country and the income gap is something that is really quite stunning. And this is, I think, a major contribution to the uncertainty and the turmoil that people feel. I was reading a report from the OECD from 2011. It's called Divided We Stand, Why Inequality Keeps Rising. And I wanted to use this report. There are excellent reports on income inequality from the CCPA, for example, and I was reading through their reports, but I chose this one because it is the OECD, you know, sort of mainstream, conservative, and I wanted to see what they had to say about income inequality, and I quote from it. They say, labor markets have profoundly changed in OECD countries since the 1980s, marked by a series of reforms to increase their flexibility. The markets for goods and services have also been deregulated, and policies to increase competition have been pursued. These reforms have promoted productivity and economic growth, and they have brought more people into the workforce. But they have also contributed to widening earnings gaps. Many of these jobs were part-time and low-paid. So that's OECD who are acknowledging that. And in fact, in Canada, the CCPA, in its report in 2015, and I'm sure many of you read this, tell us that the top 100 CEOs in Canada earned 193 times the average industrial wage. Now that's the average industrial wage, which would be a decent wage. This is not the working poor, this is not part-time workers. And that was up from 194 times higher in 2014. So no question, in this incredibly wealthy country, income inequality is staggering. We only have to think back to the last recession where bankers got bailed out and many people lost their jobs and homes. And more recently, as the finance minister, Bill Moreau, kindly informed us, he said to young Canadians, get used to the lack of security. We have to accept that in terms of precarious work. All right, moving on quickly. Number 3, people are fed up. It feels like everything's blowing up everywhere. It's like politics has gone wild. The media are more often wrong than right. Polling doesn't mean anything anymore. My God, how many times have we seen that? Not only here in BC, but all over the place. And then we have things like Rob Ford. We have what happened in the US, but we also have great things that were unpredicted and the media got it all wrong. Rachel Notley, the Orange Wave, Projet Montreal, which we'll hear about later, the Canadian election of 2015, and we also have the rise of social movements and activism. Think of things like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, the Women's March in Washington that spread out across the world that was just amazing. So all of these things are creating this turmoil that it makes it hard to figure out what the heck is going on. And on a larger scale, we have Brexit, we have the US election. I just came back from a trip to Europe, and in France, politics has gone crazy. You know, France is a very political place. They can't, you know, the left is confused, they don't know what's going on. The right has crumbled because they're facing corruption. And this guy, Macron, who defines himself as neither left nor right, is a guy who's kind of rising up the middle, Mr. Nobody. And the French are like scratching their heads and saying, what the hell's going on here? We don't understand it. I had a very interesting talk with a young intern who used to work for me in Ottawa, who's from the UK, and she's very active in the Labour Party, and she was telling me that in the Labour Party, it is so difficult because of the division over Brexit. And she said, here am I, you know, a young, white, liberal, well-educated person, and I don't know how to relate anymore to the people in our party, working people, who voted for Brexit. I don't know where to begin with that connection. And so even within a familiar political environment, there's turmoil and uncertainty. So these big picture issues are certainly playing out for us at a local level. So I asked myself the question, well, in this complexity, what's our response to that? What should we be doing as local leaders? How do we motivate social and economic equality? How do we bring about participation for transformative change? Because for me, and I think for all of us in this room, that's what it's about. We're in municipal politics for a reason. I mean, we do care about the potholes and dog shit, but we have a bigger vision about what our cities and people in our cities are striving for. So 4 things that I just want to quickly identify in terms of what we might do as a response in this uncertain world. The first and foremost is connecting locally. This is something that you do, but I think we have to understand it's more important than it's ever been before. And in fact, it might be the only place left, excuse the pun, it might be the only place left that we can have this face-to-face real connection with people, right? That's based on an authenticity about what we do with our politics. Second, I would say it's critical that we not write people off. I think it's really easy for us to put ourselves in a box. You know, we have our political ideology, and we have to you know, I think it's okay to have political ideology. It's okay to have an analysis, but it's really important for us to get out of those boxes and connect with people, even people who don't agree with us. It's about listening to people, and most importantly, it's about connecting to people who are active and who are in social movements. I've done a lot of thinking about the connection and disconnection between electoral politics and social action politics or social movement politics, and why they're like parallel universes often, and we don't work together when we actually do have common goals. And I think part of the problem is that we don't understand the different roles that we have, and we focus too much on the outcome as opposed to what's going into a process that produces an outcome. And I'll use my third response to describe that, voting. You know, we expect people to vote, and when in electoral politics we hammer away at people getting out to vote, and yet we don't step back early enough and think about why people feel cynical and why they don't want to vote. And I'm reminded of a new young MLA who's elected in Saskatchewan, Dr. Ryan Miley, who wrote a wonderful little book about healthcare and democracy. He's a doctor in a community health center in Saskatoon. And he has this wonderful story about people standing on a riverbank, and there's all these babies floating down the river, and people rush in to save these babies and go, oh my God, this is terrible, like we have to save these babies. And they feel really happy that they managed to rescue a few. Well, the next day the same thing's happening, and people rush into the river and say, my God, these babies are drowning, we have to help them. And the next day it happens again, and then finally someone says, what the hell is happening upstream? Who's throwing these babies in the water? Now, we all know that, but we don't translate that in terms of how we do public policy and how we make our decisions. And so this is a very important response to me in terms of how we engage with people, in that we don't just look at an outcome, we have to go back to where people are, right? I mean, I know this in conference is about seeking the high ground, but sometimes we have to begin in those lowlands, right? We have to begin in the lowland and think about where people are at and not write people off. The fourth thing I would put out there in terms of a response is that we have to lead and demonstrate by example. People don't buy the rhetoric anymore. They don't buy just the talking, the campaign slogans, the campaign leaflets. To me, you know, what's real for people is the doing, is the working with people. And I think back in my political experience and some of the things that really brought that to the fore. I can think back in the 1980s and when Vancouver was developed as a nuclear weapons-free zone, the first city in Canada, and we developed a network across the country. It was criticized and we were crazy and it was pie in the sky, but it was a massive participatory exercise, right? With the people of Vancouver. I'm sure some of you remember the peace walks that had 50,000 people. It was getting beyond that political box. I think about Insight, the safe injection site, that began as a local grassroots initiative and transformed up to a national debate. It began locally. And I think about challenges today like the low carbon transition, and I'm very interested to hear from Josha what the lessons and the wisdoms are around that. These are all examples where on the municipal front we're at the foreground, right? And I think that's a lesson to be learned today, that we can't wait for those national governments. I remember the debate in Parliament around Kyoto years ago. It was a big debate. It didn't mean anything. But it's here where the changes are taking place, those transformative changes. So I think when we have these kinds of responses and we do our politics differently, we engage with people differently, we break down the barriers between activism and electoral politics, and we seek out those allies and we get out of our boxes, we actually then can respond to this very complex and uncertain world. And I'm sure that the conference today will be a lot of good ideas and lessons to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. That was fantastic and a tough act to follow. Thanks for putting me after Libby, Charlie. So my name is Josha Macnab. I am the BC director for the Pembina Institute, and Charlie gave me an equally ambitious topic to cover. I didn't quite as diligently note it down as Libby did in terms of what Charlie was hoping I would talk about, but I roughly translated it in my mind to the title of Jeff Dembecky's book, which is Are We Screwed? And so I will do my best to offer some thoughts on that with regard to climate change and the clean energy economy. So I think it's fair to say that the climate landscape right now, as with many other landscapes, is changing at a dizzying pace. Every day we have new announcements, new polls, new research, new studies, and all of these pieces are shifting the ground, shifting the landscape in which we're having this conversation. And some of these changes are hugely positive. We have a carbon price, or we will, across the country. It's fantastic. Some of them are hugely negative, like what we saw happen in the States this week. And one thing is certain is that all of these pieces are contributing to change, and this change is not linear. This change has a push and a pull, and there's a tumultuous nature to what's happening right now. And so how do we make sense of all of that? I'm trying to write an op-ed right now. The last 2 weeks I've been trying to write an op-ed about, what does Trump mean for Canada in terms of climate? And I keep having to rewrite it because literally every day something else happens and my op-ed is obsolete. And so I would say, my writing woes aside, this is a very challenging time for those of us who care about the livability of this climate. If we look at what happened in the States just this past week, Trump passed an executive order. It's called the Energy Independence Executive Order. It begins the unraveling of the Clean Power Plan. We've seen a number of other things from Trump. He's slashed the EPA budget. He has removed the moratorium on the development of coal facilities on federal lands. I could go on and on. The list is long and it's depressing. Seeing that list, seeing the wake of destruction in the States, it's quite easy, I think, to feel despair and to feel like, well, what is the point? If the States is abandoning their efforts, what's the role for us? What's the role for Canada? What's the role for BC? What's the role for local governments? And we've seen this narrative emerging that, well, Canada can't go it alone. If the States are not on board, this is just way too risky for us. Our economy is going to tank, that we can't take climate action anymore. It was a nice thing to do when the States were there with us, but sorry, like that's just, it's too much of a risk for us. And I would suggest, and I expect many of you would agree with me, that is exactly the wrong response to the situation that we find ourselves in right now. First of all, I think that while Trump's actions are not to be taken lightly, and obviously any action that takes us away from reducing our emissions and away from the low carbon economy is the wrong action, there also are some strong underpinnings, some legal and procedural underpinnings in the States, which will make that undoing, that unraveling, probably not quite as grand and rapid as Trump would like to have us believe. It is still terrible, don't get me wrong. But we do need to just sort of recognize that some of what he is presenting is bluster. But I think even more importantly is the fact that when we look at what the trends actually are in the States in terms of the energy landscape, they're not going in the direction that Trump is going in. For example, coal jobs. So even the coal executives are saying, you know what, we don't think that these jobs are coming back. Like, this is not the trend we're seeing. And the problem with the coal industry is the declining coal industry in the States is not wholly due, or really very much due at all, to Obama-era climate policies. It's a very complex economic situation, many forces driving that trend. And so to imagine that, repealing the Clean Power Plan is going to bring back coal jobs is, it's fairly delusional. And right now in the States, there are 50,000 coal jobs, and that number is dropping very rapidly. In comparison, there are 360,000 jobs in the solar industry in the States, and that number is rising rapidly. If you plot the two on a chart, and you see coal jobs are like dropping like this, and solar jobs, literally, they're crossing each other on a chart in real numbers, of real terms of jobs. And so that is clearly where the trend is going. We are moving to a low carbon economy for a whole host of reasons. And I think as we see the states kind of hell-bent on stepping away, or I should say Trump hell-bent on stepping away from climate leadership, we see all kinds of other countries ready to step in and take up that mantle. In particular, I would point to China. And you know, there was some concern that with Trump's election, China might step back from its Paris commitments and from its climate commitments. And in fact, we've seen the opposite. We saw President Xi Jinping step up and say recently, no, they're committed to Paris and their commitments under that agreement, and they encourage everyone else to continue to do the same thing. Later this year, China is going to put in a carbon pricing system, which will mean after they do that, 23% of the global economy will be covered by a carbon price. Right now in China, 5 of the top 6 solar panel manufacturing plants are in China. 5 of the top 10 wind turbine manufacturing plants are in China. Now, that's the kind of thing we would have expected to hear about, you know, Germany 10 years ago. That's not the case anymore. This ground is shifting, and it is shifting rapidly, and we have to pay attention to where this conversation is going, where this economic change is leading us. And so that brings me back to Canada. And as I said, I think this is the time when it becomes increasingly important, essential for Canada to step up, not step back on this file, on climate change, on the transition to the clean economy. And when we look at what we're seeing from our federal government, I would describe it as a somewhat confused approach to climate change. You know, we've seen some really fantastic things. As I mentioned, the federal benchmark for carbon pricing is fantastic. That's a really important initiative that will drive us forward. The coal phase-out, hugely important. By 2030, will likely prevent 1,000 premature deaths as a result of that coal phase-out. Not to mention the emission reductions that would be associated with it. Hugely important. At the same time, the same government approved Pacific Northwest LNG, which will be one of the largest, if not the largest, point sources or the whole system from the upstream to the terminal will be one of the largest sources of emissions in Canada. And of course, they approved Kinder Morgan. And so it's not clear how our federal government is really squaring this climate approach and what this means going forward. But what is clear is that we need Trudeau to stand up, and we need him, especially in relation to the states, to present Canada and present our interests strongly. And we have a lot of shared interests with the states in terms of the development of the clean energy economy. And the promoting that economy will only increase the availability of clean energy jobs, which is a benefit to both countries. And we need him to hold that line and continue to push forward. We know that Canadians support climate action. We know that even after some of these rollbacks we're seeing from the states, 65% of Canadians still support Canada going it alone, still support Canada holding to our Paris commitments. And that's hugely important, that you know, Canadians we're not afraid. We want to keep moving. We're not going to be bullied by what we see happening south of the border. And so this brings me to BC. So BC also has a climate problem. We have a climate leadership plan that was released last year that sees us getting nowhere near our climate targets. Just to put it in perspective, we have our current emissions, we currently emit 60 megatons in British Columbia. Our goal for 2050 is 13, so we're at 60, we need to get to 13. The current climate leadership plan gets us to 66. So that's a problem. And we obviously need to change that emissions trajectory. If we look at Pacific Northwest LNG, remember I said we have 13 megatons. We have to be at 13 in 2050. Pacific Northwest LNG takes up 11 megatons of those 13. So not only does that not make sense from a climate point of view, it doesn't make sense from an economic point of view. Why are we locking ourselves into this kind of infrastructure when we see these global trends, these strong and powerful global trends going in exactly the opposite direction? So I would also point out that BC has a humongous opportunity. Over the next 2 decades, $7.8 trillion will be invested globally in renewable energy. And a recent study that came out a couple of weeks ago by the BC Clean Tech CEOs Alliance pointed out that there was $1.8 billion in revenue in the clean tech industry in BC in 2016, which was a 20% increase over the 2014 figure. So this industry is growing, it's growing rapidly. There is a massive emerging global market for low energy, low carbon goods and services. And BC is well positioned within Canada and globally to be a leader on this file, to be a leader in this part of the economy and to be a competitor. To be a serious competitor and take our share of this opportunity. So the question we really are asking ourselves is, what kind of economic future do we want to build for BC and for Canada? And as someone who cares deeply about this issue, and I'm sure most, if not all of us in this room do care deeply about this issue, I of course think about leadership, and I think about what I want to see from our leaders, and I want our leaders to do the right thing. And to me, doing the right thing is acting on climate change, is ensuring that we avoid the dangerous impacts from climate change that we're already seeing, that we don't allow them to spiral out of control, that we protect our environment for our children and our grandchildren. But it's not really about doing the right thing anymore. I used to point to all of the awards that BC has gotten for its carbon tax from the World Bank and the OECD, and all the praise that has been lavished upon BC for its carbon tax, and I've pointed to that and I've said, look at all these accolades, like we're getting this recognition for doing the right thing on the carbon tax, and that is still very important, to do the right thing. But at this point, it's not really about that anymore. I don't really care if you believe in climate change. I don't really care if you think that this is a problem. This is now our economic reality. And the questions that we're facing now are not about doing the right thing. It's become, how are we going to position ourselves in this clean energy economy? What is our role going to be in this new emerging world? And so the question that I would just want to leave us with is, what do we want that role to be, and who do we want to be in that new world?
Hello friends, my name is Craig Suave, City Councillor in Montreal. As a guest here in Vancouver, I'd like to formally acknowledge the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And thank you, Charlie, thank you everybody at the Pembina Institute for having me. I've met some wonderful, inspiring people, and I'm honored to be on the dais with these great women. I'm the transport and labor critic for my party, which is a progressive party on the left in Montreal. We have a party system there too. But today I was asked to speak about another really urgent matter. And to piggyback on what Josha was saying, I believe that climate change really is the most important battle of our entire generation. It's crucial for the survival of the human race and for equality and for all the justice we want to seek in the world. But there is another emergency that we're facing right now. It's an urgency that we have to stamp out immediately. It's xenophobia, racism, and hate that is starting to make the rise in North America and Europe and in Canada. I'm from Quebec, and I'm experiencing it in my own Quebec lens, so I'll try to bring that to you today a little bit and some of my experience I've had. Once this is now, it's starting to come out even more, and the water is being poisoned. The water of discourse and politics is being poisoned now. And the normalization of hate, what we're experiencing now, may lead to worse things in the future if we don't stamp it out immediately. One bad government can destroy and cut from health and education, then hopefully in a mandate or two we can fix it with good government, good progressive government. But when you have hate starting to spread like it is right now, that could be there for a generation or two. So you have to stamp it out immediately. We have to take it so seriously where it is right now. So with all the important battles we're fighting for social economic justice and climate change, we have to fight the hate right now. We have to fight racism. And you know, I was reminded a little bit from Marian Alto's presentation of the Pechacuchi yesterday with the sign, you know, that the woman had. I've been holding the sign from the 1960s with regards to women's rights. It's like, haven't we been fighting racism forever? Can you believe we're still here? We're still fighting this in Canada, and it's really more present than it has been a long time. And you know, I'm from Quebec. I'm born in Quebec. My parents are born in Quebec. My grandparents are from Quebec. I work in French. When I watch the Habs on TV, I swear in French. I'm Quebecois. But I see there's something going on in Quebec. There was the mosque shooting, 6 dead, 19 injured. A terrible tragedy and one of the worst massacres in Canadian history. Mosques vandalized frequently. Highest number of hate groups of any province are in Quebec, and they have the most amount of numbers. I'm not going to mention the hate group's name. I'll never give them any publicity ever, but they're there. The Bloc Québécois in the last federal election, I don't know if you recognized how terrible they were, but it was one of the most horrendous things that I've ever seen. It was one of their campaign videos that was attacking directly the NDP. It had a pipeline with some dirty oil oozing out of it, and the dirty oil dropped, and it turned into a woman wearing a niqab. That was one of their last campaign videos, 2015. So imagine, so the dirty, polluting, nasty oil turning into a person. That was a campaign video. It was one of the most shared videos in the history of the Bloc Québécois. It was eventually taken down from their site. You know when it was taken down? It was taken down the morning after the Quebec massacres. What a tacit avowal of hate, and they knew it. And the only person that really caught it was Paul Wells. He said, "Quick hands, Bloc Québécois, quick hands." That's what we're facing sometimes in Quebec. There is some serious problems going on. But I think we can beat it, and I think that as fellow progressives, it's our duty to beat it, and as leaders in our community. There's a few techniques I like to talk about of things that we can perhaps do, and things that I've tried to employ as my job as city councillor in my neighborhood. One, as a non-racialized person, or if you are non-racialized, you can recognize the privilege you might have as a non-racialized person. You know, our government generally looks like us. They have similar backgrounds as us. When you go into an institution, it's usually people that look and have similar backgrounds as non-racialized people. You know, as a non-racialized person, I recognize that I'm not being frequently gazed at with sort of you know, contempt or any sort of suspicion. Especially, you know, if I'm talking to a police officer, you know, I'm not necessarily being carded or suspected as much. And you know, when a bunch of white people live together, non-racialized people live together in a neighborhood, they don't live in a ghetto, right? It's just a community, right? So these are some of the things we have to realize at the very outset if we're non-racialized, and some of the challenges some people who are facing, who are racialized, or from any other minority. Second, so one of the things we have to have also in our weaponry is cold, hard facts. And sometimes that, without being, you know, polemic or without being too political, sometimes just firing up facts, like well-cited facts, can really dissipate an argument quickly. So if you're arguing on Facebook or on Twitter or in person, you know, so when I talk to people in Quebec, people are constantly overstating the invasion of the Muslims in Quebec. We constantly hear that in this sort of xenophobic rhetoric. But really, there's only 3% of Quebec people that consider themselves Muslim. 3%. You know, if you lose an election at 3%, you got killed, right? So the majority of people are not Muslims in Quebec, and there's not really invasion if we can talk about those numbers. 60% of the people that identify as Muslims in Quebec don't go to the mosque. And so the impression, if you read Quebec media and all the non-stop columnists talking about the problems of traditionalist and Wahhabist Islam theory, you would think that they're all ultra-traditionalist, ultra-conservative Muslims, but 60%, like a lot of religious people, they just don't go to the mosque. It's not a big deal in their lives. It's not a big place. It's important. These kind of stats are important. And 25%, another 25%, they go once in a while. So only 15% are going regularly to the mosque in Quebec. 48% of Muslim men in Quebec have a university education. 41% of Muslim women. Of course, they have a higher rate of unemployment for all sorts of reasons, but they are more, on the average, more educated than Quebec individuals on average. So these kind of hard facts sometimes it's really good to dissipate an argument really quickly. Another way to try to bring about more social cohesion is to create safe spaces, more places where we can talk and meet each other. And in our borough, we do festivals, like sort of intercultural festivals with music and good food. Everybody's down with good food, eh? So that's always a good way to work with it. And I was at a workshop earlier just yesterday, and I saw Surrey had some interesting initiatives in that matter too. And I think it's a really good opportunity. You can do it using art as well. I was speaking to a friend of mine, Daisy Bustani, and she had a really great phrase that I'd like to share with you tonight. If you want to touch people, you touch their heart so they can address their mind, and that can lead to dialogue. And I think that's a really beautiful way of trying to explain how we can get to people and convince them, because that would be my last point. And if there's one thing I'd like to bring to the table is the idea of moral reframing and trying to win the moral argument using values that perhaps can touch people. When we're facing someone we feel is racist or xenophobic or hateful or prejudiced, if you accuse them right away, you're already in a sort of fighting tone, right? Now, how do people react towards that? They usually dig their heels in, and they don't like it, and you're not convincing anybody, right? If I'm yelling, hey, racist, sooner or later people are going to start saying, yeah, you know what, maybe I am. Maybe I am racist. And that's what's happening in Donald Trump's United States, and that's what I'm starting to see a little bit all over Canada and in Quebec. I'm starting to see people say, so what if I hate the Muslims? So what? There's a problem. Then we have a big problem. We have a big problem right there. We can't get there. So what we have to do is to try to convince people that that's not part of their values that they really believe in. That's not part of where they are. So there's been some really interesting studies about that. You can look at studies by Jonathan Haidt and Matt Feinberg, Rob Willer, George Lakoff, who's really good at moral framing issues, that we can use as progressives to win battles and to actually convince people to stop being hateful or racist and convince people that it's not a good value to have. So what they say is that progressives tend to think of ideas like caring and equity as being part of their moral foundations, and the conservatives start thinking of things like patriotism and duty as being part of their moral foundations. Well, what if we use their moral foundations to convince them to do other things, and we try to use arguments to try to appeal to them, and that's touching the heart of the conservatives, of the people who are more right-wing, and that's the idea here. So we can morally reframe our ideas to convince people and bring them over. It's an interesting technique, and there was a really good Atlantic video about that that you might want to check out too. So we had an issue in one of my neighborhoods, Point St. Charles, where there was the same week that there was the violent massacre in Quebec City, somebody threw a brick through the window of a mosque. I mean, we already have the entire Muslim community of Quebec and across Canada that is shaken from this incident. They're traumatized, they're worried more than ever, and then somebody decides, through this turbocharged atmosphere, they decide, screw them, that'll learn them, that's crazy, right? This is what happened. So initially I went right down to the mosque, I talked to them, and they were all the people in the community, they were already pretty calm and said, it's okay, we've been dealing with this for a while. People in the community didn't want to see that. Point St. Charles, if you don't know Point St. Charles, it's got a sort of legendary history to it. It's a sort of post-industrial, working-class, hard neighborhood, half Irish, half French. Lots of immigrants used to come there from, Ukraine, Poland, and, like I said, Ireland. There's urban legends of being fighters, of being, there's the Irish mafia that had a presence there. There's the underdogs. There's a certain sense of history to the Point that people feel there. And the people in the Point that came to me after that incident, they said, we have to do something. We have to do something against this vandalism. We have to stand up and show them that's not the way we are. So we started making some calls, put a Facebook event, and the next day, which is Friday Prayer Day, we had 200, 300 people out in front of the mosque chewing a vigil, saying, no, you're part of our community. That was the message. You're part of the community. And so at this moment, I said to myself, well, there's going to be a lot of media, there's going to be a lot of people. What kind of moral reframing can I use to try to convince people that hate is wrong and pass this message out? Instead of getting up to the megaphones and going, and denouncing racists. Racists have no place here. Of course, I love to denounce, I'm a lefty. I love denouncing. I love saying resist, you know? But that's not necessarily appealing to anybody. I'm not really convincing people who might be on the lines of possibly going xenophobic, right? So I use the sort of point history. I use the sort of point working class feel to try to demonstrate that that wasn't acceptable. I said, you know, when I saw all the people around here, the 200-300 people, I said, this is the real point, St. Charles right here. This is the real point, St. Charles. I'm so proud of you guys because you really represent our neighborhood. You know, pointers work hard. Pointers look out for each other. Pointers, when we're down, our neighbors come and help us out. That's the history of the point. It's a history of solidarity. It's a history of, you know, being together during tough times. It's a history of being generous and hospitable. And this is the real point right here, and I'm so proud of you guys, you know? And this is the moral framing that I use them and using in the media ever since. And it's starting to work, and you can see people who, you know, not necessarily true blood progressives, let's just say, that appeals to them. It appeals to their sense of point patriotism. And I think we can use that in Canada to start talking to people on the other side who might be susceptible for the other ideas. So those are just some ideas, and I'm looking forward to exchanging with you after. Thanks again for having me here, everybody. Have a good day.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. First thing I said this morning to Charlie was this was the worst April Fool's joke ever. Saturday morning at 8 a.m. doing a panel presentation, but it's been fantastic. I also would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the unceded shared territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. I'm always very honored to be here. I was absolutely overwhelmed when Charlie was suggesting potential topics of leadership in a transitioning time. And I realized really I can only talk about what I know. So I'm going to approach it in three ways. One is sort of leadership in provincial affairs and issues, leadership within social justice, and how social media has potentially affected my leadership and the leadership of our union and as a woman. So I'm a president of a trade union that represents 73,000 members around the province in just about every economic sector. And we represent the majority of them in public services. They provide public services both from direct government, but also broader public services. And it really impacts the communities that all of you come from. We have approximately 25,000 members in direct government, and as I'm sure is no surprise, they are a wealth of insight and knowledge when it comes to the inner workings of government policy decisions and how it impacts. So they're important to us in telling us where service gaps are, where staffing levels are dangerously low, and who is going to be negatively impacted by funding cuts and changes in government policy. And our ranks have shrunk substantially over the last 16 years. This current government is very proud to say that they have controlled public spending, and what it's resulted in is the leanest public sector in all of Canada. And what that translates to in community is a lack of vital services for your community members. So we've been fighting back against that, but we have realized that we have to do it in a different way. And it has to be more than fighting on behalf of our membership. It has to be fighting on behalf of community. It has to be fighting on behalf of services that people need. So our members, they always talk about union members as though they're some sort of separate entity that exists in a different paradigm somewhere. But they are community members. They're your neighbors. They work with you. They belong to social clubs with you. And so what happens in their communities matter to them. And we've actually found that engaging them in campaigns is much easier when they see the relativity, just not for their own economic security, but for the growth and well-being of their communities. So some of the work that we've been doing, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of campaigns. We've undertaken a recent campaign around the fentanyl and opiate crisis that's occurring in our province. So our members have been showing their stories, sharing their stories. I've been doing a number of worksite visits, particularly in our community social services sector and our community health, mental health and addiction sector. And the stories are unbelievable. On average, our members are dealing with at least one overdose a day, but I've heard it as high as 6 to 9 in a shift. And what's surprising to us is that it's impacting sectors that we wouldn't have originally first imagined. Our librarians, our hospitality workers, clearly corrections and sheriffs are seeing the impact of this. And so we're not approaching this as, our members' jobs are at risk and, we're approaching this as we need to come up with a plan and a strategy together that's going to deal with this crisis while still protecting the safety and the health and well-being of the members who are on the front lines trying to support the folks who are caught in the crisis. So we feel we have a real responsibility as the BCGEU to bring our voice to the dialogue. And perhaps that's a bit different. Perhaps trade unions in the past were a little bit more introspective, a little bit more self-focused, but we feel we have to speak on these broader public policy issues. We've talked about children in care. Many of you will have seen, funding announcements that say we're going to get more frontline social workers. Well, that's in no small part to the work that we've done in original research showing what the impact is to communities, to children, to families when these sources or resources are not funded adequately. We did a First Nations study as well, and issued a report for affordable, accessible childcare, the $10 a day childcare plan. We advocate for improved services for seniors because they deserve them. So yes, it is about our members. It is about how it impacts their work. It's about their employment security, but it's more than that. It's because they're citizens before they're union members, and as citizens, and as their representative, we care about these social justice issues, which leads me into my second piece, which is about extending that social justice beyond just our own membership. And we have, I think, very successfully formed strategic partnerships with other social justice organizations on shared and common interests. And not just here in British Columbia, but actually right around the world, because we recognize that we live in a global economy. We live in an era of globalization, and we may live in Canada where there are employment standards that, well, here in BC I don't think are that great, but they're certainly much better than in many other regions of the world. So we need to make sure that we are lifting those workers up. So the maquila workers, for example, in Central and South America who work in free trade zones, we have free trade agreements with these countries. And for us to be complacent and not imagine that drive to the bottom of working like crazy hours with virtually no pay, no occupational health and safety regulations, no ability to fight for workers' rights, we need to be supporting grassroots organizations that are doing that work in those countries, because it's too easy for us to be impacted in a negative way by what happens there. And so that's always been one of those important pieces of work that our membership has directed us to do. And of course, we see what's happening south of the border. It's been a bit of a downward slope for the trade union movement down there for a number of years. I think it's going to get worse. And whatever happens there, we inevitably end up experiencing to some degree. We're in a little bit of maybe a honeymoon period would be the way. We saw a lot of very anti-labor legislation tabled by the Stephen Harper Conservatives. We've seen much of that pulled back and repealed, but we're not there. We know that. There are still bills that are coming forward that impact workers right across the country. And, you know, while we have been advocating for all workers in Canada, so the expansion of CPP, raising minimum wage, those are not necessarily, again, things that directly impact our membership, but it impacts all workers in Canada. And that's one of the ways in which we're able to engage with people outside of the trade union movement. It's not about self-interest, it's about rising everyone up. And finally, I'm going to touch really briefly on social media. I know Libby touched on it, the fake news, and that has been a huge shift in how we operate and how myself as a leader operates. I am probably more accessible as a prison union boss. Sorry, that's what somebody called me in the media the other day, and I just can't get over it. But as a union leader, I know, as a union leader, I'm probably more accessible than the presidents who came before me. My members Facebook message me, they text me, they tweet me, and that's fantastic. I am absolutely thrilled with that ongoing engagement that we're able to do. But we've seen the flip side of media, or social media as well. It was used to great effect in the Obama campaign. It was also used to great effect by Donald Trump. We see internet trolls and anonymity that allows the kind of hatred and xenophobia that Craig was speaking about to proliferate. And as a woman, it means that I have to be cautious. I am always aware when I am in public that somebody has a smartphone with a camera on it. I am always aware that my conversations, even one-on-one, can be recorded. My Facebook page is set at the highest security levels that I possibly can, and everybody is divided into groups. So what I share with one group, I don't necessarily share with everyone. It is constantly there, but it is a tool for great engagement as well, and can be used as such to move people from clicktivism to activism, to engage them in a pyramid of engagement that where you are really connecting with them in a meaningful way. And so we've been working as an organization on doing that. We have a whole new digital department, and it's been very, very exciting for us. So I'm going to leave it there because I saw the 2-minute sign. Thank you so much, Dan, and I look forward to any questions that any of you may have. Thank you so very much.
Well, I'd like to thank each of you for rising so admirably to the challenge. You did great. So we are going to open the floor now to questions. We are going to take sort of 3 at a time and then give our panel a chance to address them. So as I mentioned, I'd like you to keep your comments or your questions to 1 minute, and Dan here is going to help you do that. And who would like to start? Please, would you mind sharing your name as you get to the mic?
Betty Baxter, Chair of the Board of Education, School District 46. I had about 6 questions, but Stephanie's last point came so close to the core of what I want to ask that I'm going to use my time for that. Given the impact of big data, and I'm sure we've read the articles about Cambridge Analytica and the way that Trump could customize his campaign messages directly to what the audience wanted to hear. My sense is that we're pretty naive in Canada in managing that, so I'm thrilled to hear Stephanie's comments that we're moving. But I also go back to Libby's about how the media doesn't get it right, and mainstream media isn't there anymore. Is there anything any of the panelists can tell us? Because I think our local constituency associations, our local candidates, they're not even at the stage of protecting their Facebook pages. So I think we're behind the game already for the BC election. I fear we may still be behind in 2019 in terms of understanding that power. So I'd love to hear any comments on how we can get sophistication at the local level so that we can touch people to the heart and not have them simply reinforce those messages of hate or extremism that they already might be believing, because that's what they will get from our opponents in many cases. So I know it's a little bit of a complicated topic to ask in a minute, but there you go. Any more you can tell us would help.
Thank you. Next person, 3 at a time. So next one. Thank you, Betty. That was good. A lot in a minute.
This is so tall. There we go. Kirsten Duncan, Councillor for the City of Maple Ridge. Just following up on the topic of hate, I'm finding, now that Trump is elected, I'm finding more and more I'm getting these weird and strange emails that don't necessarily come off as racist or inappropriate initially, but they certainly get there the farther I read down. I'm sure colleagues in the room have had emails from places like the Immigrant Watch Society, and lucky for me, they, for whatever reason, decided to drop off paper copies at my city hall, which my receptionist can't even throw in the garbage for me because they're labeled with my name on them and they don't say where they're from. My way of dealing with this is, as a university student, I actually forward those to my instructors and I ask them to discuss them in their classes, and I use them as examples so people understand what hate speech looks like. My challenge is that in the council chambers, while we have set decorum, people don't seem to understand what that really means. And so we say, you can't say certain things that are inappropriate, there's a decorum here, you have to respect that, and yet I still find that when people are speaking, they bleed into this inappropriate zone, and it's very difficult to tell when you need to call someone on that. So I'm wondering if you can give any advice to that. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
Hi, my name is Trina. I'm from Southeast Kootenay. I'm a trustee there, and I'm also a constituency assistant for our MP. First, I want to thank everyone for sharing your insights this morning. It was wonderful to listen to. And my question is directed at Craig. I get way too many calls from people about Motion 103, which is on racism. And I would be really curious if you were to recommend one book, what you would recommend to read to speak to the heart of these callers. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we've got three really good questions, one specifically for Craig, and I'm going to open the panel to invite you to respond. Do you want to start, Stephanie, down at that end? And
Okay, I think we figured out how this works. We didn't turn it on. So I wanted to address Betty's question, and thank you for that. It is a very steep learning curve, and I think one of the biggest struggles we have, as whether we're political leaders or leaders in a social movement or union leaders, is trying to also understand that we're currently balancing a real shift in demographics. There are my members who will still insist that they want a paper FYI or a bulletin. And then we have a whole new generation who are actually now the majority of workers are 27 and under in Canada, who don't get their news from traditional media sources. They get it from Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. And so how do we filter through that noise? I think there are some very good tools and resources on how to effectively use social media, and there are some social justice groups that do an incredible job, like Lead Now. We actually poach them when we can, because they're teaching us, and it is something that I think you have to be cautious about, but not afraid of. And I find that sometimes people my generation, that's their fear. So when we first started talking, like having a member forum, unmoderated member forum, there was a lot of concern. Like, what happens if there's something said publicly that puts us in a position of liability? And what I tried to explain, because this is what my kids would tell me, is imagine a water cooler at an office and people are standing around talking, and sometimes they're going to be critical. What we have to do is to address the criticisms and make sure that people are not putting themselves at risk for some kind of blowback, because if they publicly criticize their employer, there's arbitrations that show they can be fired. So we have an obligation to educate people as to where they can go in these conversations, but we also have an obligation to understand that there's a certain freedom that comes from that. And so we're still working our way through. It is complicated, yes.
Going this way. So I'll address the first question about social media first, and then we'll go on about techniques maybe. I'm actually also a political organizer. I organized for political parties, and I'm on the board of directors of my party in Montreal. And for social media, I think we have to start realizing that there are different approaches that we're going to have to take. It's funny, as a progressive, I was often critical of the mainstream media, and now we're sort of like, well, they kind of had a role too, It's kind of strange. But social media takes a variety of techniques and it moves very, very quickly. So in our parties and in our movements, we should hire data experts. We should consider that a really important hire. People that are also to date with Nation Builder, Action Sprout, all these other sort of techniques that might be out of date in 3 years, but they're effective now to learn. And we have to train our candidates and our community activists in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. We have to train them. And oftentimes, we want to control the message all the time. Maybe we're just going to have to decentralize a little bit more to our candidates and allow them freedom to be authentic and to express what they want to express and recognize that everybody's different and help them be really convincing and good at using social media so that they can defend themselves and realize some other things like not to feed the trolls, etc. Not to feed the trolls. How to convince somebody, or what kind of book to read to respond to motion 103. If someone, I think to myself, there's nobody that's not worth trying to convince, but some people are, neo-Nazis now, right? I mean, should we spend a lot of our effort necessarily trying to convince the people that are really hard convinced on the other way? Maybe it's not the best use of our time, but I think there are a lot of people, most of them somewhere in that convincible place that we should be targeting and with smart messaging. And so indeed take the time, but I haven't read any one book on hate. I haven't read any direct books on hate, but I read a lot of articles, and I recommend reading George Lakoff. He's a linguist and psychologist, I believe, and he's a political linguist and psychologist, and he looks at word usage and framing and these ideas. He says, the word tax relief is always going to be negative. Taxes are bad, and you hear the word relief because you have to relief from pain. Everything's framed one way, so if we start realizing how we can start framing messaging clearly, then perhaps we can be more effective. And then with regards to for sure, and follow them on Twitter. And the moral foundations theory was this sort of moral framing I was talking about. There are thinkers such as Matt Feinberg from U of T, Rob Willer from Stanford, and Jonathan Haidt, and I believe it's something called moralfoundations.org. Really interesting work they did on Trump, so I really highly recommend that.
I can't hang up on them.
Well, you do your best, right? And try to and have a bit of a conversation, see if it's salvageable. Not your judgment call, I guess.
Okay, Josh?
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of the things that have already been said. I would also talk about the fact that I think what social media has also changed is the fact that, as a number of folks have already alluded to, this is now not a one-way conversation anymore, right? It's not just like, here's what I think and I want you to believe it, so I'm just gonna, shoot it at you 1,000,000 times until I somehow penetrate your skull and you somehow, start repeating the things I hope you repeat. It's about engagement, and I think any good organizer from time immemorial will tell you that that's what it is about, and I think social media enables that in a way that previous forms of media haven't. But I think that a lot of times we still use social media in that sort of one direction way that isn't it isn't the most effective way to use that tool. And I think one of the things that we're recognizing, I can speak for Pembina in particular, is that actually, if you realize that and you want to actually capitalize on the strengths of social media, it's like a whole retool of how you spend your time and resources, because that takes a lot of time, and it takes, if you want to do it well and you want to do it with integrity, and have legitimate, honest conversations with people, that's not something you can just do off the side of your desk while you're doing everything else at the same time. And so for us, for sure, that's something we're grappling with right now. It's like, okay, so that means I'm not going to be able to do this piece of research over here on what's happening in these particular climate trends, and instead I'm going to talk to this one person for however long about whether or not climate change is real. So, you know, and those are the kinds of trade-offs. And so I think what's important to remember is that this isn't something you can just add on top of everything else you're already doing. It actually, if we want to do it well, has to be something that is a conscious reallocation of our time and effort to participate in. I also just wanted to address Kristen's comment about how you call people out when they are saying things that are inappropriate. I think that this happens all the time, and I just wanted to acknowledge that I don't have a good answer to that question. I would encourage anyone else who has a good answer. Those situations are so difficult. They're so challenging when you're in that space and you see something happening that you know is not right, and you need to have the courage to stand up and say something, and that's often very, very uncomfortable. And I would just encourage us to support each other in those spaces and to find ways to have each other's backs when you see someone stand up and do that, to jump up, support them, and then maybe it becomes a bit easier for us to take those courageous stands when we know someone is going to be there with us, supporting us. So that would just be the one thing I wanted to add to that piece of the conversation.
Thank you. Libby?
Thanks. Really good questions. I think there's two big mistakes that elected representatives make in using social media. First of all, people see it as just some kind of like amazing, as we've heard, message tool, right? And it is a way to get your propaganda out. And if you approach it that way, it's a huge mistake, because it is a two-way street, and you've got to be prepared to get all the feedback and actually engage with people. And I think that's really that's partly the question that Betty's getting at, is it is a sophisticated tool, and we actually have no training in it, right? We just kind of get out there. The other big mistake that elected people make is saying things that they then instantly regret. I mean, now all political parties vet everything, like for candidates, that you've done on Facebook and Twitter, right? They actually go through, and because there are things that are going to come up. Every party digs up dirt on other candidates, what they've done on Facebook, social media, and so on. So you have to be very aware of that. So we actually have to filter ourselves. I mean, I've been caught out. You know, I know what that's like. So, you know, it's that instant response that you hit out, and then you realize it was something that you shouldn't have said. I want to get to your question about when you said, well, I can't just hang up on them. Actually, yes, you can. It's the way you do it. I believe it's very important to call someone out. That's part of leadership, and I agree with the whole notion of creating safe spaces. It's not always something you can do, but if you're in a position, an environment where you can like shut something down that is evil and toxic and poisonous and racist and hateful, then we actually have a responsibility to do that. I've been on many phone calls. You actually get a sixth sense about this. I can read any email. I'm not joking. I can read any email and I can tell you what the subtext is, because I've read thousands of them. And I know whether or not really what's underlying that is a racist sentiment, right? You just get a sixth sense about it. And in terms of phone calls, when I've encountered that, you have to do it politely. You have to be very clear about what you're saying. You have to say, I really think that what you're saying is racist. I'm not going to listen to this conversation, and therefore I'll end it. And then you hang up. You don't respond in anger. You don't respond by just slamming down the phone. And you will get people angry at you for even doing, a polite way. But it's the right thing to do, because we actually have to say, we're not going to engage. Now, it's a judgment thing, because I agree with Craig. And I tried to say this in my remarks, we have to engage people that we perceive to be conservative or different or have a very right-wing point of view, right? It's part of our community, it's part of our constituency. But nevertheless, there are judgments that we can apply to that. In some spaces, you can have a moderator. My partner, for example, works at rabble.ca. They have very active political discussion boards. They have moderators. They have rules of engagement. Right? You're not allowed to be racist, xenophobic. You're not allowed to be sexist or homophobic or hateful or make personal attacks. If you do, you're off the board, right? So even within social media, we can create environments that hopefully foster a safer space. And lastly, if you're part of a political organization in some way, we have to apply a lot more sophistication to the way we use social media. You know, it's not just like some little trick box that you can pull out. This is a very sophisticated tool, and we actually need to work with people who understand how it works if you want to use it effectively. Not to be manipulative, right? And I think that's a very easy thing, to end up seeing it as a manipulative tool that politicians can use. We have to use it as a truthful way of engagement by setting also our own boundaries about how we use social media.
Thank you. Stephanie, you had one more.
Just on this issue of social media, one piece that I'd forgotten to speak about, and you will need to consider, in my view, because we have to work with people who clearly are not always of a like mind. And so on Twitter, for example, you know, I don't filter my Twitter followers. People follow me, they follow me. But I'm followed by some highly placed people in a political party that I would really love to publicly disparage. I'm not gonna lie, my personal feelings around certain policy decisions, I would love to go out there and just kind of do the trash and, you know, what are you thinking comments. I can't, because as a leader of my union, I need to represent my members. And so I need to have a working relationship that allows me to have dialogue with these people to ensure that we're advancing my members' interests. And so you have to be careful about, I mean, there are things I would love to retweet and I don't, because I know I'm followed by people who would immediately report that. So you do have to really think about what are the working relationships you're trying to build as well, and sometimes put your personal stuff just away somewhere.
Thank you. That was a very fulsome and amazing response from all of you. We have time for one more question. Is there somebody who would like to make it? Mr. Stipp.
Why not? I'm close to the mic. Ron Stipp, CLC. It's two questions, and it's for two. No, actually for Libby and Stephanie, and then for Josha and Craig. I guess I wrote them down. Hang on. Hoping for this opportunity. So actually, they're very simple, and you could probably do them in 30 seconds. For actually Josha and Craig. You talk about facts, but my facts are different than yours. How do you deal with that? And for Libby and Stephanie, we're in an echo chamber. How do we get outside of this echo chamber to learn what's going on in the world?
Thank you. All right, over to you. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, alternative facts. Different. That's right. I mean, this is a problem that this is a huge problem, a social problem that we have right now is the fact that this is even a conversation. I mean, there's always been sort of a give and take of opinion versus fact, I think, in any discourse, but this is now a real problem that we're facing. I don't have a great answer to your question. I'm hoping maybe Craig will say something more articulate. But, you know, I think that a lot of these questions are about media literacy, or about literacy in general, and the idea of, you know, whenever I encounter someone who says, well, I keep picking on this example, but I don't believe in climate change, for example. It's like, oh, that's interesting, and where did you get that from? Like, where is that coming from for you? And I say, well, I do, climate change is real, and here's who I rely on, and you know, trying to just articulate, just have a bit more of a conversation about where we get our information from and why, and where there tends to be more consensus or less consensus. I don't know. We struggle with this all the time. I don't have a great answer to the question. So.
Okay.
Green. I thought that's plenty articulate. That was good. It's tough, and I think it's even harder in the climate sciences area because there's so many people that are trying to obfuscate the facts. Oftentimes when I'm dealing with people with regards to their xenophobic comments perhaps on a Facebook post, oftentimes I'm finding they're not backed up by any facts. And just using a simple, StatsCan report or, Statistique Québec report and just firing out a simple tweet or this is the actual percentage, here's a link, where's your link? And oftentimes having good sources helps too. So it's tough for sure when people are conspiracy theorists though, and they're in a zone where you got that from the government of Quebec that's protecting Muslims and working for the environmentalists. You get this kind of stuff. Well, it's tough there, but I guess you have to build trust with people after a while as a leader, and we all do our best to do that so people take our words seriously. So it's a tough one though for sure. But I still believe in cold hard facts with good sources.
All right, Libby.
A great question again. Well, I think in politics, Ron, your question to me and Stephanie was, how do we get outside of our own echo chamber, right? So politics is a very reactive business. We spend most of our time reacting to things that are just like hitting us. It feels like a tidal wave. I'm sure you experience that locally, right? The emails, the phone calls, people you encounter. And so you're always reacting to that. And so I think part of getting out of the echo chamber is to consciously set aside time that you engage with people, different people in a different way. So for example, when I was a Member of Parliament for Vancouver East, I would make a conscious decision to create lists of groups and key people that I needed to talk to in the riding on a semi-regular basis that weren't necessarily people I considered allies. I actually needed to get out of my own comfort zone, right, to go talk to people who had a different perspective. It was very important that I hear what they're saying and try and figure out what some of the commonalities. Now that doesn't substitute, and I think it's very important in politics, that in doing that you also need to have a very strong connection to your base. We all have a base. Whether we know it or not, we all have a base, and staying connected to that base in a very real way. People, might be a core number of individuals, right? They're your reference points. They keep you grounded. They keep you real. They're your sounding board. It's very important to have that too, right? Because otherwise you'll just be like blowing in the wind. And how many times do you hear that about politicians, right? That they're just reacting to whatever's going in front of them, and they'll go yes to this and yes to that because somebody raised it at a public hearing or whatever. So you have to have your grounding. Leadership is about sometimes standing your ground, right? And actually taking on opposition in a very forthright way. But at the same, so it's a very delicate balance because you actually want to be open to other points of view. So I think keeping your base connected and happy, but also recognizing that there are other diverse viewpoints and elements, and connecting with that and getting outside of your own comfort zone and being conscious about doing that, right? Don't just let yourself react to everything.
And Stephanie, last word.
Thank you. Yes, Ron, you're absolutely right. And that it can also, unfortunately, be one of those downsides of social media is oftentimes you may inadvertently, especially I find on Facebook, when you're adding people in a conscious level, you tend to build an even bigger echo chamber. And so your news feed is always filled with information that you agree on. I think you do have to push. Thankfully, for me, with 73,000 members, they don't all think like me. So I would say, on a regular basis in conversation with people who ask some pretty tough questions about policy positions we've taken as a provincial executive, why they want to know why we're funding one particular party. So I do have those questions and I'm challenged by that. But it's an interesting, I have to delve into the question you asked for Craig and Josha, because it's a really interesting thing. I have come to learn that there are people that I literally call flat earthers, who, regardless of what facts you will show them, regardless of taking them up in a spaceship and showing them that the earth is round, will never believe so. And I don't waste time on those people anymore. I've just stopped. It's just not worth my energy or my time. I'm more interested in having conversations with people who, that Craig identified, are kind of in the middle there. They're not really sure. They're hearing all of this information, and how do I provide a counterbalance to some of that? Traditional media has not always been balanced either, let's just be honest. Yeah, all of you will know that in your community papers, you know, if there's a particular issue you're dealing with and the newspaper gets 25 letters in support of a position you've taken and 2 that aren't, they'll publish 1 in support and 1 not to give this idea that it's balanced, but it's not a real representation of the majority of people's opinions. And that is, I think that has been amplified hugely by alternative media sources. So to get out of the echo chamber sometimes, Ron, I read the comments section. Get yourself a big glass of something and read the comments section. Yes, and sometimes you will definitely get out of that echo chamber, but thanks.
Okay, let's give this fabulous panel a round of applause.